Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Hello and welcome to David Bahnsen's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review, where today I think what I'm talking about is going to seem totally outside the normal category lines of economics, of capital markets, and the way in which I talk about those topics to promote the free and virtuous society. It's going to seem less directly correlated to our normal topic, but I want to, by the time I'm done, make the argument that it's extremely correlated and that there is not only a connection in these things, but a much bigger connection than I wish there were. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about something that kind of blew up the internet over the last 5 days or so. That was Tucker Carlson bringing famed white supremacist Nick Fuentes onto his podcast. And then the next day, or it may have been 2 days later, Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, issuing a big video and podcast release defending and reaffirming Heritage's relationship with Tucker Carlson. And it seemed to, by the time we had the weekend, hit a fever pitch of folks that were either really animated in their defense of either Kevin or Tucker or Nick Fuentes. Dear Lord, I can't even believe what I'm saying right now, but I got to get through it. And then the other side of this animation may have been people that were really quite upset, quite distraught that an organization as prestigious and historical and established in conservatism as the Heritage Foundation, that at one point actually featured Lady Thatcher herself on their board, that they would be in a position of defending someone like Tucker Carlson, who himself has gone, apart from the guest he has on his podcast, who himself has gone to a place of such dark and deranged conspiratorialism, kookiness, and certainly a position as it pertains to Israel that I believe to be anti-Semitic. Whether he's faking it or not, I can't speak to. But even if someone decides they don't believe his positions are anti-Semitic, that he most certainly wants people to believe they are, and has an anti-Israeli position that is unrecognizable by most of us in conservatism. And then you can say, okay, well, maybe I want to just separate what Kevin did from what Tucker did from what Nick did. And I don't. I think these things are all kind of connected, but there are plenty out there, albeit less, in the civilized and credible orbit of conservatives. But there are plenty who want to defend Nick as well. You know, he's just a Catholic guy, a conservative guy who says some provocative things, but is ultimately concerned with the direction of the country and the way in which the DEI moment is treated white men. He's just standing up for whites and then says some provocative things on the way. Well, I gotta connect the dots here, so you're gonna have to bear with me. I recognize that so far I haven't necessarily said anything in the lane of what this podcast is about, and it doesn't seem to be directly economic. But let's just start by saying there's nothing defensible about Nick Fuentes. If it were just all shock jock Howard Stern type stuff, it's totally unacceptable and outside the lanes of any decent person's definition of decency. But it isn't just merely provocative and shock jock stuff. There are substantive arguments he makes in defense of Hitler and substantive arguments he wants to make in defense of Stalin. And he doubles down on them all the time. And he has said enough things to put him outside the bounds of common good decency that I won't give him credibility by wasting time rehearsing all of them. But then people could say, okay, well, David, that's fine. Now, this, by the way, is what Kevin Roberts did. He said 2 days later, Nick Fuentes is really bad. I think all his stuff is really out of bounds. But then he wanted to defend Tucker for having him and said, well, that's different. And in theory, I would like to say that I do believe a reporter interviewing a bad person is different from being a bad person. But let's be very, very clear so that we don't ourselves fall into a trap of being too cute here. Tucker Carlson was not a reporter interviewing someone. He interviewed him as if he were a fanboy. He sat there Googling over this man, saying what a fan he was of Joseph Stalin and other world famous historical butchers. And what is the reason that Tucker Carlson, who worked for Fox News for years and years, who worked for CNN, who worked for MSNBC, who was a writer for the Weekly Standard, who was a writer for other conservative publications over the years, has been in any number of lanes in the traditional veins, accepted, credible. He was an educated man. He's a smart man, by the way, that he would sit there and be so supportive and platforming of such a bad apple like Nick Fuentes. Well, first of all, Tucker's been doing this for a long time. And the fact that he went so far and so outlandishly over the line to have Nick Fuentes on, and to have Nick Fuentes on in a very approving, gushing context is, I guess, worse. But it's a difference of degree, not kind. I mean, he put on Daryl Cooper, who's a laughingstock of a historian, and he called him the greatest historian. He's not an academic. He's not a published author on it. He is a crackpot. And he got him on to say that Churchill was the real villain of World War II. And this is all well and good being cute by half for a little while, but it is part of a movement of Tucker that is either, and again, I've said this before, people can decide what they think is worse. And they can also decide which one they think is at play here, whether Tucker is being market-driven, trying to capture this large young male incel, belligerent crowd that is often quite anti-Semitic, or if Tucker has himself gone through an ideological shift. But what we can sit here and speculate where Tucker really is about the Jews, if you want. But what I know is that Tucker has decided to go to a woke right, essentially a right-wing version of critical theory, whereby the entire world is oppressed and oppressor. If that sounds like Frankfurt School Marxism, it is. But the difference is that Tucker, rather than doing it by race, gender, and class, class being, of course, the preferred method of Marx, race and gender and sexuality being the newer categories for victimhood available in the woke left of our culture, Tucker's gone all in, and now I'm about to get close to doing my economic message of the day, to this notion of there being elites and then there being the regular guy, the little guy, the common man who's out there just trying to grab his lunch pail, support his family, go to work, make an honest living. But there are private equity people or Illuminati or Goldman Sachs or something that often is going to involve some Jewish folks, and maybe it sometimes does not, but it is centered around their being elite and powerful, and they are out to get you. And it is the most outlandish victimhood mantra, an ethos of victimhood that exists today. And while the absurdities from 2020 to 2022 or so that manifested themselves usually from progressive leftists about race and gender and so forth are also in the same vein of some form of a bad guy versus a good guy, there is no difference in the Tucker worldview, which is adopted by many, many, many people today. that would identify as populist new right. And I am here to say that this is the big connection to economics. And then this is the connection to Kevin Roberts. Now, I don't want to say Kevin is or was my friend, but Kevin and I, in our limited interactions, have been very friendly. The guy is a charming guy, and he's a smart guy, which is what's so hard for me. I think Nick Fuentes is dumber than a rock. I think Tucker Carlson is smart, and I know Kevin Roberts is smart, and that makes it so much harder for me to watch this. But Kevin had me on his podcast. I went to Heritage's office in Washington, D.C. about a year and a half ago when my book, Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life, had come out. And he had a long interview with me about the book and the message of the book. He seemed to be a big fan of it. Heritage had me come speak at their big event in Sea Island earlier this year. There's been a couple of endeavors and efforts that we've worked on together around shareholder resolutions. I mean, there's a lot of great people that I know at Heritage. There's a really high number of great former Heritage people I know who I think of very, very fondly and whatnot. But no, I mean, Kevin is all in on this thing about the elites are out to get us, and the old kind of liberal order has failed, and that the traditional metrics. He's been a big critic of market orthodoxy, that dying on the altar of the free market. Now it's time for us to fight fire with fire and use the sword of the state to our benefit. And that comes from, I believe, his frustration with certain things, status quo, and the belief that the left had institutionalized power. The right wasn't very good at using power, and that we were going to take the power back and use it better in the future. I believe in winning elections. I believe that there's power that comes from being in office. I believe in influential people having money, having think tanks, having technology, having business, having, there's commanding heights of culture that I like to see the good guys recapture. But what I don't believe in is using power, force, coercion, to then go violate boundaries and lines that we believe in. They are limiting principles that we advocate for as conservatives, that are either limited because of constitutional jurisdiction or limited in terms of the principles we believe in any number of spheres. But where I guess I'm going with this is I do not believe that Kevin Roberts is anti-Semitic. But I think Kevin Roberts is wrong to defend someone who is anti-Semitic or platforming someone who's explicitly anti-Semitic. I think that Tucker is dead wrong on most things he's been saying for a long time. And if I thought it was just a simple case of being defensive of one's friends, I'll be very candid with you. I'm sensitive to that. I believe that friendship and loyalty matters. Now, it does not matter where you have to change your opinion on an issue. Like, I love this person, they believe something I don't believe, so now I have to believe it. Obviously, I understand that people need to draw the line, but I could understand having a hard time coming out publicly against someone who I had a long time friendship with. But there has to be boundaries. There has to be a point at which you say enough's enough. And I think Tucker has long ago passed that line. But regardless, the issue I would say is that when it comes to the things we talk about on this podcast, back in the old days, meaning 5 days ago, when we were talking about the right condoning things they had never condoned, but not a Hitler sympathizer, a Stalin sympathizer, back in the old days of 5 days ago, when the only thing the right was doing was defending a president usurping constitutional authority to increase taxes and calling it his right as an emergency act, when the only thing we were talking about was the government taking equity positions and ownership in private businesses and picking their own favorites and winners and losers in a free market economy. These are issues that should have infuriated all of us already. And when this was several years ago, Tucker, if he has indeed genuinely radicalized in the last couple of years, there was already a progression headed towards it, where before I would have identified him as someone who had radicalized. And I recall Tucker having Ben Shapiro on his podcast as a guest. I don't think that's going to happen now, where Tucker made the case that this was just outrageous, that we were still allowing automated truck driving technology to develop. Why didn't we just outlaw it immediately? Because it was going to hurt the truck driving industry. I don't think it is, by the way. I think there's still going to be a huge need for drivers. There's going to be other jobs that get created. There's this, that, and the other. But here was Tucker just saying, like, it was so obvious that if we see one bad thing happening in the market to one group, that the state should just intervene and do a bunch of other bad things to other actors. This is stuff that, like, no conservative with an 8th grade level of conservatism would ever stand for. And that's where Tucker had been for quite some time. And then, do I believe that Kevin, in his defense of Tucker, has a sincere friendship issue, which I might be sensitive to? And do I believe that that Kevin is likely not on board? I mean, he wrote a great piece blasting Nick Fuentes a couple of days later. But why is there this need to stay cozy with Tucker, given where he's gone, and the just absolutely outrageous act of him platforming Nick Fuentes? Is it possible that the problem we're seeing with Kevin and Heritage is not anything like radicalization of anti-Semitism? It's radicalization around walking from basic conservative ethos, from basic conservative principles. These market principle things that people are going crazy about, they're not like distinctive, nuanced, weird things that don't really matter that much. It's table stakes. Your view of a free society is table stakes for being a conservative. Now, I totally agree that there can be reasonable people within the conservative orbit who disagree from time to time in the weeds on a given issue. You know, Buckley did that with Milton Friedman on certain things, with Ronald Reagan on certain things. All of us conservatives are in favor of vigorous debate within our own kind of camp to get down to what we believe about certain issues and try to get policy right. And I'm a big tent guy. These people are not big tent guys. They say that they want to throw out Mitch McConnell. You know, a bunch of them wanted to throw out John Thune. One of the past presidents of Heritage, Jim DeMint, famously said he'd rather lose with 30 Republican senators that are right on everything than win with 60 Republican senators that are not. And I'm paraphrasing because that isn't the exact language what he said. But I mean, he was, very opposed to big tent Republicanism. I'm for big tent conservatism. What I'm not for is big tent non-conservatism. What I'm not for is allowing people in the camp that do not believe in the core basic tenets of what many of us have dedicated our lives to, that many organizations like Heritage at one time had dedicated themselves to. I'm bothered immensely by Kevin defending Tucker. I'm disgusted immensely by Tucker platforming Nick. And Nick Fuentes is an awful person who should have no hospitable embrace in the conservative movement. But this podcast is brought to you by National Review. And National Review is the 20th century story of how these things have gone in the past, when our founder, the late Bill Buckley, had to cast aside the radicalized John Birch Society because they were no longer appropriate playmates in the sandbox. The anti-Semites, the racist, the extreme elements, and by the way, I include in this the cuckoo bird conspiracy theory side, which just so happens to so often be correlated and overlapped with the anti-Semitism. Just a really, really weird coincidence. Those folks are not part of the movement. And if you believe that the top marginal tax rate should be 36%, and I believe it should be 34%, that's not what I'm referring to about the time for a divorce. And there can be all sorts of debate on given issues that are even more, complex than that one about what the top tax rate may be. There is a bandwidth of acceptable disagreement in conservatism. But the fact that markets should not be run by central planners is not one of them. And you don't make it more palatable or more acceptable to simply point to a cultural excess like DEI or BLM or ESG or CRT that you don't like and say, no, now is the time that we need to suspend the Constitution or go impose this or do that and say it's all okay. I'm not doing this podcast about my concerns about Trumpism or President Trump himself. When he has a policy issue he's right on, I say so. For example, some of the stuff he did in the Big Beautiful Bill Act around pro-growth measures in the business tax code, he should be called out for it. His general posture of being for greater U.S. energy independence, he should be commended for it. And I do it all the time. Think of it, it's a lot of the president's instincts do lie there, and I say that as a good thing. And where he's wrong on certain things in what I consider to be a protectionist orientation or a zero-sum fallacy understanding of global trade, then I want to call him out on those things, and I do. But this whole subject about Tucker, Kevin, Nick is not really about President Trump. I think Trump had Nick Fuentes in one time in Mar-a-Lago. I think he genuinely didn't know who he was, and I think he genuinely cut ties with him. And Fuentes went through the campaign being vehemently anti-Trump. I haven't seen Trump entertain a lot of these bozos very much. And when Tucker was all over Trump about going to take out Iran's nuclear capability, and Trump went to social media and went after Tucker for it. This isn't a beef about Trump. I got a few of those, and the trade issues I've talked about on this podcast are often one of them. But no, I think right now why the heritage thing and Kevin thing matters to me is because I think that the think tanks, first of all, I think ideas have consequences. Second of all, I think George Will is right that first you win the debate, first you win the argument, then you win the election. Third of all, I believe that my late friend Charlie Kirk was right. As much as Charlie and I disagreed on certain things, I think he's right that hospitable debate with people you disagree with is important, but that within our own movement, it was imperative that we have certain standards and criteria. And we could disagree about what those standards criteria ought to be. And in fact, the last argument I ever had with Charlie was about his embrace over Alex Jones. And I don't think Alex Jones should be platformed in any serious conservative place. But I feel the same with Nick Fuentes. I feel the same now as to where Tucker stands now. But I don't think that's totally separate from economics. I think that there is a general lane right now in so-called new right thinking that is deeply connected to the errant view that what has happened in our economy is that rich and powerful people are trying to stick it to the man. This allows them a framework for condoning some of the behavior or social maladies we may see in certain pockets of America that might be a more rational explanation for some of the problems. But what it then does, and this is the concluding thought, but also the kind of major takeaway of today's whole podcast I made you listen through. What it does is always with these folks call for a government imposition. You're so worried about how much power elites have that you want to entrench more power in Washington, D.C., more power with the government, give more economic control to central planners that they will then steward us. And this was Hayek's fatal conceit. It's easy to say AOC and Mamdani and Elizabeth Warren have no business having the keys to the car. You know who else believes that? All of us, all conservatives, all Reaganites, all of us who love Emmett Burke, all of us who love Bill Buckley, every one of us, traditional conservatives, happily trying to fight the good fight in a post-war liberal order, believe that those people should not have keys to the central planning. But nor do I believe that anyone else should. Nor do I believe that let's replace their elites with our elites is good public policy. And even though they don't, for whatever reason, have the guts to use that language, that's what Kevin Roberts and Tucker Carlson are saying, is that it's just gotten so bad we need to put our people in to go then do abusive things with market controls, market policy, economic policy, etc. This top-down management, but it will be done better by us than the other folks. My friends, this is all predictable stuff going on. I don't think it was predictable that there'd be a school of thought that we needed to condone someone like Nick Fuentes. I thought Stalin and Hitler, when I was in elementary school in the 1980s, I thought they were a pretty bright line that conservatives wouldn't go past. So now we have people either defending them or defending those who defend them. Well, no, not over here. Not going to happen. And it's not going to happen for the same reason that I'm not going to throw in the towel on the importance of free enterprise. Because you can talk all you want about how bad things are and how you need some drastic measures to go deal with them, but there is nothing so bad that you have to violate all of your own principles to address it. There is nothing so bad that we have to sell our soul and the soul of this movement because of frustration, impatience, and in many cases, lunacy. Radicalism is a byproduct of the French Revolution. Promoting a free and virtuous society is the byproduct of the American Revolution. And to that end, we will work here at Capitol Record. Thank you so much for listening. Look forward to being with you soon enough. Take care.